Morning. Call a meeting of the Cemetery Board, New York State Cemetery Board to order, and we'll introduce the chairs, the members in a minute. But I want to just take note that Tom Fuller is your first official meeting for the Department of Health. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And you won't see him. You probably never did, but just take another point of privilege that the guy that keeps most of this stuff working, the IT stuff, Tom Burton, is retiring today. So unseen, but not he'll be missed. So I'll just take note of that. So again, I'm Mark Patterson, Chair of the Board.
I'm Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
Tom Fuller, representing Department of Health, and
right.
Dr. Zucker.
And I'm representing Rosanna Rosado, Secretary of State. So thanks for everybody for being here. Other people?
Louis Pelishuk, Division Director.
Alicia Young, Division Accountant.
Mike Seelman, Division Senior Investigator.
Len Breen, Division Investigator.
Brendan Stanton, Division Investigator.
Tony Melillo, Counsel to the Board and Division.
Okay, thank you all for being here. We have the minutes of the previous meeting. Does anybody have any additions, deletions, or corrections?
No, because we don't have Paul anymore.
Does anybody have additions, corrections, or deletions? I had none. All right.
I had sent you some changes, but were they made? No.
I don't remember seeing any.
We discussed it at the pre-meeting, but
I don't remember if we'd even circulated the minutes before the pre-meeting.
All right, I think we're okay.
So I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as mailed.
Second.
All in favor?
Oh, I did make the change.
You did, yeah. Okay.
Minutes are accepted.
Yeah.
Is the change worth noting?
No, it's in.
Okay.
The change was made, so it's right.
Great. Tony, do you have pending legislation or rules and regulations? I know you've sent a new format to it.
Yeah. So some new items have been introduced. Nothing's been moved. Everything's just been referred to committee. New bills, though. Let's see. This is an interesting one. I don't know. This is one that has actually shown up before. This is Assembly 4027. It's a one-chamber bill. Provides for a one-year study of package pricing for funerals and funeral services. What's interesting about it is it requires individual item pricing to continue to be offered. And it requires that the package prices be broken down and listed by their component parts. So even when there's a package offered, they have to itemize the individual items in the package. But then it says, except for direct cremations, direct burials, forwarding of remains, and receiving of remains. Those things don't have to be itemized. I'm not sure why. And I'm not sure how that impacts our crematories, that their fees would not be listed, itemized in a package price. All right. We also have a couple of bills relating to veterans, New York State veterans cemeteries. A5347 has been introduced. Executive Law 365 requires the establishment of a program for veteran cemeteries, but it requires a study first and it requires a funding being in place first. This amendment would do away with the requirement that the study and funding be in place before the program is actually initiated. And it gives a date of January 1, 2021, by which the program has to start. And then there's Senate Bill 3780, also relating to veteran cemetery, which would permit funding of the program through donations by individuals, corporations, and groups to the existing Veterans Remembrance and Cemetery Maintenance and Operation Fund. But like I said, everything's just been referred to committee and no other action has been taken on any of the bills yet that I could see.
Anybody have any questions or comments about those bills?
Well, this first one you discussed, number 16 there, I don't see where that would have any impact on cemeteries and crematories, but that would certainly require some work on the Department of Health side to make sure that the current regulations line up with that. The reason that they don't have to itemize out the direct cremations, direct burials. Those are already, when we talk about package pricing on the funeral home side, it's an area where you can combine items and then discount them.
Okay.
So when people call for funeral home and ask what their direct cremation price is, they can compare funeral home to funeral home and get just one price, includes several specific things, and you can lower that one price from what it would be if you did it a la carte.
Okay.
So that's already done that way in the regulation.
Okay. Good to know. I did want to, in addition to the report, let the board know we have to revisit the delegation of powers that was done. We've been discussing it in counsel's office, and there are some issues, but I think it's, because it's legal issues, I think it's appropriate to discuss in executive session.
Okay. Anybody else have questions for Tom? All right, Lewis, division report?
Yeah, a couple things. So I should have written this down. We've received approximately 530 annual reports total. Was it 542?
547.
547, of which I believe 127 were submitted electronically, which means we're still getting just under 25% in being submitted online, which is consistent with what we had last month, which means hopefully that trend will continue, which is more than double the percentage that submitted online last year, which is obviously a good thing. Division vacancies remain vacant. We still have no assistant director. We're still down 3 accountants, actually, 2 in Albany and 1 in Buffalo. And we wait word on at least some of those. We're currently seeking to fill only 1 of the 2 Albany positions, and the Buffalo position and the assistant director. So the next thing on the item is on the agenda is the withdrawal of the division's July 2014 memo concerning the Nonprofit Revitalization Act. That act is still on the website for now. It is going to come down soon, hopefully. The memo is going to be withdrawn by the division, mostly because the statute's been amended several times since then, and it no longer accurately reflects what the statute says. So it is going to be withdrawn by the division. It should not be relied on by anyone as of effective now. If you have, people are obviously welcome to try us first if they have questions about the various provisions of the Revitalization Act, but it's really the Attorney General's statute. The Attorney General's office was responsible for getting it passed, and they have a lot of stuff about it on the Charities Bureau's website, which is charitiesnys.com. We also have a memo out there which we're not withdrawing, a guidance about certain very basic things like how to handle very simple related party transactions, like 3-person volunteer board. Board member Joe's brother Frank is going to do the mowing. What do we have to do? That's already out there. That kind of basic stuff we're happy to help with, but if you're getting into really exotic stuff under the statute or stuff that really only applies to larger cemeteries, they typically have lawyers, and your lawyer is also a good first place to look for information. So that's going to be coming down from the website, but it is, as of today, withdrawn, no longer in effect.
And in conjunction with it no longer being in effect and being withdrawn, is there any sort of affirmative statement that's going to be made by the division, just letting people know?
I just did.
Okay.
No,
on the website or for folks
we can
who
put it.
aren't?
I will see whether we can get it on the website. We're not going to do a mailing about it.
Okay. I was thinking more the website.
Yeah.
I think it's worth pointing out, one of the reasons this came about is the memo was incorrect with regard to board's duties with regard to conflict of interest and whistleblower policies. And since those, especially the conflict of interest, is something every not-for-profit corporation, which means every cemetery corporation, has to comply with, really every cemetery should not be relying on that memo and should get its own independent advice as to what the board's duties are with regard to conflict of interest and whistleblower.
The Charities Bureau has sections on both of those on their website, which is charity. They have their own website. It's charitiesnys.com. It's not. I mean, you can get there through the Attorney General's website, but they've got their own thing, and they have a whole lot of resources about that. The last thing, which is not on the agenda, is there's been some talk about radioactivity and cremation. We did get one inquiry from one cemetery about this. I've spoken to Tom in his capacity as a representative of the Department of Health, and we're going to be speaking to, hopefully he or I or both of us are going to be speaking to some of his other colleagues about that to see really whether and to what extent there is an issue here that requires further study. Frankly, I've previously said, probably here, certainly in talking about this issue in continuing education sessions with funeral directors, is that this is mostly a theoretical concern. It is a rare thing that someone's actually radioactive enough to contaminate something that's being brought somewhere. But because there's been some discussion of it both in the press and with CANA, the Cremation Association of North America, we're going to look into it a little bit further. Nothing to do yet.
Okay, so any questions for Lewis? I think just the summary is that we in the terms of the withdrawal of our guidance on the Revitalization Act, we will work with our folks to try to put some notice that the guidance has been withdrawn. Getting the websites adjusted these days is tougher than you think, but we'll see what we can do, and we'll get the memo withdrawn as soon as we can. And those that get stale when you got something that says something to withdraw and there's nothing there, so I'll have to get some advice about whether that's the perfect thing. But we will continue to remind people through our regular interactions of cemeteries. Okay. Vandalism report.
Okay, so far in this fiscal year, we have collected $240,000 and change in vandalism fees. Our appropriation for the year is $939,000, of which we spent it all. Applications granted are just over 1.6 million, and we have another almost 2 million pending in applications. Now that includes a 794,000 and change that is going before you guys today. What we don't, since we don't yet have a state budget, we don't know what our budget will be for next year. But I know the initial draft of the budget had a significant increase in the fund. However, I'll give you a caveat with the applications pending. With the exception of the stuff we're putting before the board today, the fact that an application is pending and has a dollar amount attached to it doesn't mean we're going to recommend that amount. We haven't finished reviewing it. A bunch of stuff may be disallowed. The whole thing may be disallowed. That said, and based on past trends, in all likelihood, if the appropriation in the final budget is what the proposed appropriation is now, we're going to have spent that entire appropriation of next year's money this year out of this year's claims. Not things that are approved this year, but things that came in. Partly things that are approved this year, partly things that came in this year but we approved next year, which means there will be a lag in payment for pretty much everything coming in from now on. Again, we don't know what the final number will be.
Yep.
But that's right now what we're facing.
Because the applications granted category, those are applications that are going to be paid out of whatever we're getting.
Necessarily, we're going to start paying. Well, I mean, they could wait even longer, but theoretically,
But that's the calculus.
No, but also the pending. The applications granted are not going to would not, as of the current level of appropriation, use up all of next year's money.
Okay.
But applications that came in this year that we haven't finished reviewing, if we were to review all of them, I'm predicting that would.
Okay.
We don't know that for sure yet. I mean, and there's some wrinkles here, which is we are typically now only paying 25% up front with the balance on completion. Depending on the schedule of work, it's possible that final payments will slide into a subsequent fiscal year, which frees up some amount of money. But we have to, once we've approved an application, we have to treat that application as using
That's
the
true.
money
The
here
stuff we've
now.
already approved, right? So,
Right, that's also true of stuff that's already approved. This is, to be clear, this is not a cash report. I can tell you we've spent our entire appropriation.
we've
But I-
encumbered it.
Right. No, we've actually spent, we've paid out 939. It's not just encumbered, it's actually gone out the door.
Okay.
But how much more is going to go out the door and when is really somewhat out of our control. That goes from us to our fiscal bureau and then over to the
We've
comptroller's
already
office.
expended the 939.
Right.
None of it will.
But the schedule for next year is not entirely predictable for a couple reasons.
Yeah. So again,
With that said,
governor's submission more than doubled the appropriation, but the demand is exceeding that.
partly because we had 3 extraordinarily large claims last year, of which 1 had special funding attached but didn't cover the whole thing, and 2 did not. That's not the whole story, but it's part of the story. The other part of the story is that dangerous monument. We've discussed this before. Dangerous monument applications have, as a trend, gone up.
Okay. So we have 11 dangerous monument applications and 1 abandonment application.
Correct.
We can go through them one by one if folks want. We can then decide if we can vote consent decree or by consent order or not. So, town of Oswegatchie is in St. Lawrence County for $504,610.71. It's again an abandonment. Are there any questions about that?
Yes, we've this previously came before the board and was tabled because we hadn't gotten from the town, partly our fault, a accounting of the money they had spent. What happened to the money they inherited from the cemetery and what their income and expenses on the cemetery have been since they took over. We've got that now. It's in our report.
We
I
also
actually
have
think
a representative from the town of Oswegatchie here.
Thank you.
On that point, I think the numbers, unless I'm missing something, could be clearer. I mean, so the requirement of this disclosure is in our regs, and it requires from the municipality a certification of the current status of the cemetery with respect to abandonment, funds of the cemetery, investment income therefrom, donations, if any, whether the cemetery currently sells lots or graves or performs interments or cremations, and the annual number and total revenue. What I was hoping to see, it's kind of unusual for a cemetery that's been abandoned to a town to have ongoing operations, so we haven't quite gotten the analysis right yet because we don't see it often. But I think it ought to be in sort of a balance sheet format. So you see the monies that the town received when it took over the cemetery. You see income and expenses, and then you see monies remaining afterwards. We don't quite have that. And one of the benefits of that is, first of all, so that the board has an idea of how much funds the town has available for some of the projects that are part of the application, but also to ensure that funds are being used only for the cemetery and not for other town purposes. So I think that would be a better. I don't think we're quite there yet. The information that's presented here is better than it was last time, but I don't think we're quite there yet.
Is that something that we can discuss? Because we want to put this in a format.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Schedule.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Well, that said, we have reported, and they have backup to support their expenses, what they inherited, what their expenses have been since then, what their income has been since then, their cost of maintenance, and where they're at right now. So, I guess what I'm asking is, do we have Subject to, we probably do need to come up with a better and clearer way of reporting this. I think there's enough there. I would respectfully submit there's enough there for you guys to approve this thing now.
Division recommended the approval, right?
And I stand by that.
Okay. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add. Okay. Any other questions about the town of Oscogachi in this application? Do you want to go through these vote one by one, or do you want to go through and, well, we take that one separately than the other vandalism fund? So I'll make a motion to approve the application from the town of Oscogachi for $504,610.71 for their maintenance of the cemetery. Second? Second. All in favor? Agreed. Motion carried. Application approved. All right, we have 11 dangerous monument applications for Slope Cemetery in County Steuben for $15,319.88. Anybody have any questions or comments on that application?
The list is in a different order.
Next is Grove Cemetery, which is also in Steuben County, for $12,735.26. Anybody have questions or comments on that? Fairview Cemetery in Steuben. Steuben's a hot county this year. $11,383.26. I'm going too fast. Just slow me down.
Wait, Mark, what was the third one? Because I have these in a different order. I'm sorry.
None of the application that you.
So I have Hope.
Fairview is the
Grove and Fairview. Okay, never mind. We're good.
Pleasant Valley, also Steuben County. The last one is Steuben County. They must have meetings for $21,582.04. South Valley Cemetery, Otsego County, $25,960.78. Hillington Cemetery, Otsego County, $67,858.68. Fly Creek Cemetery in Otsego County, $27,058.30. Milford Cemetery in Otsego County, $21,323.61. Covington Union Cemetery in Shenango County, $24,109.54. Walton Cemetery in Delaware County for $35,021.70. And the Hale Eddy Cemetery in Broome County, $27,813.80. Said that awkwardly. These are all, if they are approved, subject to funding availability, contingent on funding availability. Any questions or comments for the staff, or anybody, staff want to make any particular comments? Okay. So I'll make a motion that we approve the 11 applications for dangerous monuments that are in the agenda that we just discussed for those amounts. In a second. Second. All in favor? Aye. Motion carries. Those applications are approved, again, subject to funding availability.
Just for record-keeping purposes, these are for y'all's signature. We don't have one for Oscogachi yet. We'll run down and do that during the break.
Okay. Next is a discussion, an application of Canary Falls, Prospect Hill Cemetery, abandonment to another cemetery.
Yep.
Louis, do you want to?
Yep. So this one, Canary Falls has essentially been, Prospect Hill Cemetery is inactive. Canary Falls Cemetery is right next door. They've been maintaining it for years. Essentially, they want to formalize the relationship and have Prospect Hill Cemetery abandoned. The other Prospect Hill Cemetery board has resigned, and really, it hasn't really been a functional cemetery for a while. Canary, in addition to getting money from Prospect Hill, is the interest that they have is in making sure that the cemetery next door to them doesn't become run down so that, which could potentially hurt their business.
Okay.
I think we may be seeing a few more of these coming down the pipe where you have two next door and one ceases to be active and the next one
So are they,
wants to take it over.
What's the functional? What's the technical? They then become one cemetery, or are they just in some sort of?
Not really. Well,
Is it a merger?
It's not a
it's not
merger.
The language is in NPCL 1506-C, and what the legislature did was mirror language that's in the town law, section 291. And I think the intent was to have the same effect. Well, let me withdraw that. Because the language is similar, you can assume that the intent was to have a similar effect. But it is really different to have a cemetery take over the care of another cemetery versus the town. The town's duty is really just to maintain the property, and that's it. And in fact, it's because the town's duty is so limited, the town's liability is also limited. And there are cases that say, if that's all the town is doing, it isn't responsible for people injured on that cemetery, that kind of thing. I think we have more of a responsibility when a cemetery takes over an abandoned cemetery. I think the cemeteries themselves probably anticipate that. So I think the effect, even though the language is similar, is more impactful when it's a cemetery taking over an abandoned cemetery. The property does become theirs versus a town. Title to the land just kind of sits out there. But I think when a cemetery takes over an abandoned cemetery, it's really taking it over.
So they then take on all of the affirmative responsibilities and duties as the cemetery they took over.
When a town takes over an operating cemetery, its duties are greater than if it's just mowing. And so I would, in all cases, I think when a cemetery is taking over an abandoned cemetery, there's an ongoing operation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be taken over. There's still lots to be sold.
I mean, in this case, the only real possible difference might be as to liability because Prospect Hill is largely inactive, and all they're going to be doing on that side is maintenance. And that's all they've been, and they've already been doing that. But in other cases, this could be much more of a real issue. Here, it's sort of
no longer an active board, and
right. And but more importantly, Prospect Hill is I think it's pretty full, if I remember right.
It's there's no lots left for sale. It's
Right.
a small 3-acre cemetery, and the board did resign. We went to a special meeting that was held November 19th of last year, and the board of Prospect Hill formally resigned at that meeting. And
So it's conceivable, it's theoretically conceivable that Canary could find lots to reclaim in Prospect Hill. But Canary got enough lots to sell. This is more about formalizing the maintenance the maintenance, I don't even know if it's a formal agreement, the maintenance arrangement that's been in place and giving them access to both sets of funds.
Well, and really the funds of the abandoned cemetery become the funds of the taking over cemetery, just like for the town. So the liabilities would travel with the assets as well. And certainly trust funds remain trust funds, if there are any.
Right, this is different from a town. Every single restriction of one of our cemeteries still applies. It's still one of our cemeteries.
PM funds, right.
these cemeteries are side by side as well. I don't know if you're aware of that. So if there was an ideal situation for an abandonment, this would be it because they are side by side.
It's also the flip side of that is that's why they're doing it, is that there's risk for them if the town, I'm sure the town would do a good job, but if, let's say they didn't, that's no longer in that cemetery's control. They need to be able to control what goes on next door.
Okay, so because it's not a merger and because they remain two distinct entities, the funds that are now required to be in the PM funds for each cemetery, they remain there. And there isn't a concern that because they have the authority over those funds, they would be able to, I guess it's always.
They're still subject to
Okay.
whatever, I mean, we're still auditing them, but they're still filing an
As
annual
two separate
report.
entities.
Well, do you,
No.
you see it as one set
We
of
would see it as
funds?
one set of funds.
Right, for the combined
Right.
properties. So, I mean, that's a difference right there. Yeah.
But there's still, the funds are still restricted. If Len goes out and inspects them and he finds that they're cutting the grass more often on the one side and not the other side, even though they've combined the funds, we can talk to them about that.
They would still retain their names, their individual names, just be run by one board instead of two.
And they're in the same town.
Yes. They're not 200 miles apart.
A little discussion. Okay, so this is
Very vague answer to your very
The other
question.
thing is, I don't anticipate an application for abandonment funds here, even though it's theoretically available. I'm not saying one couldn't come in. To the extent they would try to seek funds based on deferred maintenance, I would at least view that with healthy skepticism, given that they've been doing the maintenance for years.
I should also point out, this is an area that's ripe for regulation. And
Correct.
I've discussed this with division, that really we need to have something in place that tells the cemetery what its obligations are going forward.
Yeah, I guess I just, thinking ahead when you mentioned that there was a possibility that they could be reclaiming lots, then I guess it seems a little bit ambiguous. How, would that be for the benefit of the existing cemetery where the lots are, or, what funds? I don't know. It's just,
Whether or not they formally end up dissolving Prospect Hill, they are effectively going to be operating as one entity going forward.
I don't think we've had a dissolution following a cemetery
I think
takeover or a
we
cemetery.
may have years ago once.
Yeah. What would have had? About 3 or 4 of these? Abandoned
This
to the
is, I
cemetery?
think, the fourth.
Yeah. Right.
from a policy point of view, this is a preferable. There may be other options preferable to abandonment. Certainly.
Exactly.
Down.
That's why the legislature passed this.
Those things. So this is preferable. It keeps the protections for lot owners in place, keeps the protections that have been invested in terms of funds in place, right?
And that actually brings up a good point. The analysis is it has to be beneficial not only to the cemetery that's being abandoned, it has to be beneficial
Right.
to the cemetery doing the takeover. So we have an unusual situation here where this taking over cemetery has already taken over the cost and expense of maintaining before the abandonment occurred. So this doesn't change a great deal. It probably does help.
It benefits them because now they have some money to do it.
Right.
And there's no risk of it either not being maintained as well by the town or ending up in limbo
Yeah.
some way or another.
And the analysis said it has not degraded the taking over cemeteries funds in any way, right?
Right. No, there'd be no effect on it.
Not just because they've been doing it, but in the time they've been doing it, their financial situation.
Well, they've been paid to do it.
Yes, they're
They did pay each other to do it.
utilizing the funds from Prospect Hill.
Okay. But it has not hurt.
How long have they been doing it this way?
3-4
At
years?
least since 2011.
So we're just basically formalizing what's already there.
And taking out one board.
Taking out, yeah.
It's a small community, everybody, knows everyone basically.
Prevent the risk of
The boards, both
a real
boards.
abandonment to the town.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we've received any care complaints.
No, every time I've been to inspect both cemeteries, they're well maintained, so there's no problem.
Which is the one being abandoned?
Prospect Hill.
Yep. You could probably find it quicker than I can. What are the funds that are being transferred?
Over $400,000.
Break that down? Like what's PM, what's general?
Yeah, hang on a second.
PM?
Hang on, we got this. Prospect Hill. Okay, hang on. permanent maintenance is 400, just over 400, and then there's another 30. There's a $10,000 special trust and another 36.5 in unrestricted funds. Canada Harry, by comparison, as of now, has $2 million in its PM fund. Sorry, $2 million in general, $9 million in PM, and a $27,000 special trust. So the money is sort of a drop in the bucket to them, but it's real money.
The Prospect Hill Special Trust, do you know what that is?
No idea.
Canada Harry understands it has to honor the trust.
You will remind them of this fact. It's reassuring that Canada Harry itself has special trust funds itself, so they're used to dealing with that.
Good.
Any other questions or concerns about this application? I'll make a motion to approve the application of Canada Harry Falls and Prospect Hill Cemetery as an abandonment to another cemetery.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. All right, Lewis?
Frederick Douglas. The receiver at Frederick Douglas is asked if it is available if we need her. If we already anticipate needing her, I'll give her a call right now. If not, we can start talking, and if we need her, we'll call her.
Okay.
So Frederick Douglas is in Staten Island. It dates from about 1935. It was mismanaged by its, well, I believe is their sole trustee towards the end, and which resulted in an extensive investigation by the division and a successful lawsuit by the Attorney General's office to get rid of said trustee. Unfortunately, she proved to be judgment-proof. The AG never recovered any money from her as to money that got mismanaged or worse away. The cemetery's been in receivership since late 2004, early 2005. The current receiver has Lynn Rogers Lynn Rogers is the receiver of the Friends of Abandoned Cemeteries of Staten Island. Her organization that she works for is the property manager. They have done extensive work to stabilize the cemetery physically. They've renovated the office. They've filled in. They had a lot of sunken graves. It's a real issue in that area. They filled them in. They've generally spruced up the place, and they have recently identified, the place is almost full, but they've recently identified 75 new graves that they're going to be able to sell, and they had a little bit of history last year. They were sued. The lawsuit was baseless. It was dismissed on that basis, but that hurt sales. Demand seems to be ready to recover. One thing that's been hanging over their necks, now this is the focus of this application, there are other things in this application, but one thing that's been hanging over their heads is that the previous superintendent president, Ms. Morton King, did not pay workers' comp. Someone was injured. Comp got a judgment against the cemetery, and it is this. I am not going to give a legal opinion here, but it is the cemetery's view and that of potential trustees that they could be held personally liable to workers' comp based on the fact that the organization has a judgment against it. This concern has frustrated previous attempts to take the cemetery out of receivership and put it under control of a board. Late last year, workers' comp and the cemetery had a series of conversations where workers' comp is going to offer the injured worker a cash-out settlement and assume the risk that that worker will not take the settlement. So the claim is for, was it $135,000? $165,000. They're going to offer him $41,500, I believe it is, to cash it out. And if he takes it, great. And if he doesn't take it, workers' comp's going to assume the risk. They want the cemetery to pay $41,500 to be done with it. They don't have the money in unrestricted funds. They need to use PM funds to do it. They also, during the receivership, had a bunch of emergency work. They lost electrical power to their office, and they had to have emergency electrical work done. The previous receiver did not ensure that through a series of things that were only partially the previous receiver's fault, tax filings weren't made, and they had to resolve issues with the IRS. The result of, and then there was a bunch of other maintenance that had to be done on an emergency basis. The result of which was that the receiver used PM principal during the past year to make sure these things happened without first going to court. So this is a combined application. Part of it is nunc-pro-tunc, and part of it is prospective. The total sum is about.
A quick question.
Yeah.
The failure to go to court, was that based on sort of exigent
Yeah,
circumstances?
she had to get the work done. She had a deadline, and with the IRS, she had a deadline for submitting whereby they would waive the penalties. So that's 45 grand of the application, 45 and change, and the workers' comp piece is 41.5, and the accountant piece is, where is it?
5,700.
Yeah. So that should add up. I should have put the total up front. Oh, there it is. There it is. 97 and change is what they're seeking.
And they're seeking to.
They need your recommendation to go to court to get a court order allowing them to use PM funds for this. Look, the reality is this is not going to leave them with much. This is not going to leave them with a huge PM fund. They already are underfunded in PM. They're at 226,000. This is going to bring them down to, 140,000 more or less. But the receivership's ending in May. There's a group of people who are prepared to take over as a board. They can't personally assume workers' comp liability, and the receiver. And I think, I can't speak for them, I haven't spoken to them directly, but the group of potentially interested lot owners who might constitute a board come May are really see this application as a way of closing the book on all of the bad stuff that has happened before and allowing them to move forward. It also, I think in everyone's view, putting workers' comp behind them will make it easier for them to fundraise. That people have actually asked about this in connection with trying to raise money. So this will close the book on that. I'll note that we are recommending that the board recommend approval subject to council's review of the petition. The cemetery's attorney, who's doing this for them on the very cheap, was on vacation, did not draft anything yet, so council has not seen an actual petition yet, and is not going to be able to. We can't fully recommend approval until we see that. Having said that, there's one more very important thing that I left out. They have to take or reject the deal by April 13th.
The workers' comp.
Yeah. So I think they have to at least get in the door to court by April 13th. I don't know that they need to have an order entered in the clerk's office in Staten Island. The clerk's office in Staten Island moves very slowly. But they need to at least have something before a judge by then, which is why I'm bringing this now without a petition, because this is time sensitive.
Do we, just in terms of the logistics, do we need to give an approval, or are we literally, approving the petition? In which case, that we're not approved. We don't have to see the petition to approve it.
No, you're not approving the
Okay.
petition. You're making a recommendation to the court.
Okay. In concept.
Right. The statute, this is 1507A. Upon application to the Supreme Court, the court may make an order permitting the principal to be used for purpose of current maintenance and preservation of the cemetery or otherwise. Application may be made by the cemetery board, a notice to the corporation, or by the corporation, a notice to the cemetery board. And actually, let me read the next sentence because it brings up a point I want to make. Unless the cemetery can clearly demonstrate it lacks sufficient future revenue to make repayment, any such allowance from permanent maintenance fund shall be in the form of a loan, and the court shall determine the method for repayment of such loan by the cemetery to the fund. So it almost never happens that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just want to go back to our approval. You don't read that to mean that we are approving the application, that we actually have to see the application?
I think it's the form of. I think what the board has always approved is the amount and the payback.
Okay.
I mean, the sufficiency of the information, actually the Attorney General's office and I, because usually the Attorney General's office appears on behalf of the board, we have to be satisfied before we
Okay.
permit that to go in front of the judge. So there's that level of scrutiny is always there.
Okay.
But the board always approves the amount and the payback.
Got it.
Recommends approval to the court. It's very rare that this board approves a grant instead of a loan or approves recommending grant. This might be a case where the board might want to consider it. I'm sure the division has been very careful in its proposed payback. Proposed payback is minute. 5 years of no payments, and then 20 years of $3,000, and then
15 years of $3,000,
15,
then a balloon
sorry.
payment.
And then a
And then a
balloon payment
balloon.
Which we know they'll never be able to make. Which we
Right.
all know they'll never
Yeah,
be
yeah,
able to
yeah.
make.
But at least the court is going to agree that they don't have to pay.
Right. So, and this does represent almost half their PM fund. I mean, this.
It's a little less, but yeah.
Yeah, it's close to half their PM fund.
Though not, since their PM fund is so small, it hardly changes anything, right?
Well,
No,
the success or failure of Frederick Douglass isn't going to depend on it repaying this loan. It's going to depend on,
them getting more money.
yeah, and having a really active board. So this might be one of those rare circumstances where the board might want to consider making this, recommending that the court make this a grant.
The only reason I didn't ask for that is I didn't think you would give it.
Like I said, it's almost
Originally,
never
they
happened.
asked us to make this an outright grant. And one way to sort of finesse this would be we could make it, if the board were inclined to recommend a grant as opposed to a loan, we could work with the cemetery to increase significantly their permanent maintenance fund contribution on lot sales, either immediately or when their cash flow permits it, so that they can use that to rebuild the fund. That way, they don't have a court order hanging over them to do it, but we could, if they actually start turning things around financially, we could bump up their contribution to 25, 35, 40% on lot sales.
And one thing's for sure, this cemetery will, for a long time coming, have the scrutiny of division, because it's been a problem. It needs division's oversight, and division has given it the oversight.
It's also going to need our help.
Yeah.
We're going to be there a lot just to provide technical assistance.
And it sounds like if we were to only approve it in the form of the payback being, it being a loan rather than a grant, what are we accomplishing? I wonder in terms of the continued health of the cemetery, what we'd be accomplishing.
Look, if they're still operating in 5 years, they can afford to pay $3,000 a year.
Well, that's why your
But-
suggestion that that something that they need to start paying back the permanent maintenance fund if they get to a certain threshold. Is that what you were thinking?
No, I was thinking it was slightly different. I was thinking making this an outright grant, but once they
Yeah.
are able to make it wouldn't be that they're paying it back per se, but we'd increase their required contribution to the permanent maintenance fund
Yeah.
on sales.
Yeah, I mean, even without a loan, if a cemetery has an inadequate PM fund, division works with them to get it where it should be.
Yeah.
So that would be the normal oversight that division.
I mean,
I
the
think that makes
success or failure of this cemetery is going to depend on the new board's ability to fundraise / obtain grants.
And then division's ability to make close observation of how they're doing that is really going to be going forward the important piece.
Now, I anticipate that we will ask them, their finances permitting, to continue to send us quarterly reports the way the receiver has done.
Yeah.
And wasn't there another option of adjacent cemetery with some potential?
Let's not go there right now. I brought that up, and the guys next door didn't take kindly to the suggestion. I think that will be an easier and better conversation to have between boards of operating cemeteries, maybe with our assistance, a little further down the road.
Okay. Well, I'm willing to entertain that, although I'm sorry they didn't make that suggestion prior to the board meeting, so it could be thoroughly vetted. But
I mean, I'm happy. Look, that was their original application. If the board is comfortable with making this an outright grant, I think it's better for them. But I didn't think anyone would go for that, so I structured a very low and delayed repayment structure for them.
Ask, please.
Yeah,
Right. Exactly.
I didn't want to ask for everything.
what's the sense of the board?
They would certainly prefer a grant.
I think, based on, reviewing the application and then the discussion here, I think it makes sense to do it as a grant.
Okay, so motion.
Motion to approve this with the $52,569.53 being a grant rather than a loan.
Subject to council's review of a draft petition.
Is it 52 or is
Oh.
it 90?
97,569.53.
Right.
All right. I'll second that motion. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Great. You want to swap the order of these things?
Sure. Well, actually, you know what? Why don't you go ahead and do Wildwood now? I'm going to step out and let Frederick Douglas, because she's waiting by the phone for us,
Sure.
know that we did it.
Can I have just a 1 minute?
Yeah, we'll take a short break, and we'll come back to deal with these other two. Meeting back to order for a short break. We're going to take the application of Shenango Valley Cemetery in Broome, a merger application. This is going to be sort of an overarching discussion. We have no intention of a decision today, but we wanted to have a conversation. Last month, we had a conversation, went to executive session, heard from our attorney. We kind of want to put not that exact conversation, but the broad outline discussion on the table for public discussion today. So this is an application that we're Forest Lawn, one of our premier cemeteries and cemetery operators, who has done things like this in the past, is proposing to merge with a cemetery in Broome County. It's really different in scope and scale, maybe even covering some same issues that are true with the ones they've already done, in terms of some areas that we just want to make sure we've got nailed down. So do you want to lead that discussion, Tony?
Sure. So I did an analysis of the issues that could arise out of this. Of the mergers that I'm aware of that have occurred in the last 10 years, they've been in the same county or an adjoining county. This is the first. So this is a case of first impression, as lawyers like to say. Whether a cemetery in Erie County can merge with a cemetery in Broome County. It's 200 miles away, 3-hour road trip. There's jurisdictional issues, but there's also even, just as an example of the impediment, there's a section of the MPCL that Article 15 actually that talks about. Well, actually, it's. Let me pull it up. It talks about additional requirements for incorporation of a crematory. It's Section 1505, and it acknowledges the possibility of filing of a cemetery existing in more than one county. It talks about the filing of the certificate of incorporation. It says the certificate of incorporation, this is 1505, paragraph A. Certificate of incorporation of a cemetery corporation shall be filed in the office of the clerk of each county in which any part of the cemetery is proposed to be or is situated. So even though it permits more than one county, it sounds like what it conceived of was a piece of property that extends outside of one county and into an adjoining county. It doesn't read like it anticipated the scenario we have in front of us, which is quite a distance, non-adjoining counties. So that and other issues were raised. I spoke on Friday with the attorneys for the two cemeteries. I was just pointing out the issues. We didn't resolve anything. We just had a very frank discussion. I expect that they're going to address the points that I raised. I suggested they could do that to the board or to me in division before it comes to the board, but it's at their option. And division has its still analysis and review once we get all the legal issues even resolved. One thing was made clear: the cemetery in Broome County is in dire straits. It has a small board. The person who's acting as counsel is also, I think, chair of the board. He's been doing this for a very long time, and despite his best efforts and the best efforts of others, this cemetery is not doing well. It's failing, and if this merger doesn't happen, there's probably an abandonment down the road, and maybe not far down the road. I think division could probably talk about that since they're more familiar with that. That's the information I received in my phone call with the attorneys.
That's pretty much a certainty, isn't it, Brenda?
Yes, I mean, they've been repeatedly calling our accountant in our Binghamton office pretty much on a monthly basis to ask if there's any surplus, if he can help them calculate whether they have no general funds to operate, and they've been operating by drawing down the surplus of their permanent maintenance fund. As soon as that surplus runs out, they'll be no longer able to operate.
So, but another wrinkle here is that this isn't, what's it, the former Buffalo City Cemetery? Is that yeah. This isn't the only non-adjoining county merger it anticipates. It did a notice of meeting of lot owners where it also sought approval to merge with the cemetery in Saratoga County. There may be others, I don't know, that it's anticipating merging with. So this is going to be a precedent-setting decision. And whether the policy implications of having a cemetery exist across the state are many. You have lot owner meetings, you have lot owner rights to see records, you have notice, and you have the issue of an abandonment. What happens when you have a cemetery that could be as far flung as this could be, fall into abandonment? I mean, we went through great difficulties with Whispering Maples, which is in two adjoining towns, because division had to come up with a recommendation on how the funds should be divided between the two towns, because it was one set of funds, and here you would have one set of funds. And
One set of funds meaning all the forest lawn and, I mean, they
once they merge, there's
they're
one
just
cemetery.
distinct. There's no.
Yeah.
Right, one
I mean,
separate.
This is a merger, not
Yeah, I got it,
abandonment.
yeah.
Yeah, there would be one set of funds. So who gets what? That was quite a dilemma with Whispering Maples.
You mean how to identify what funds would be applicable to
Each piece.
to each of the different
Right.
cemeteries that were part of the corporation.
Now, one of the nice things in Whispering Maples is that the towns did adjoin. They actually, I think, share a corporation council. So they're working that out between themselves.
That's the one up in Plattsburgh.
Yes.
Correct.
Right. I don't know if you would see that kind of cooperation if you have pieces in Erie County, pieces in Broome County, pieces in Saratoga County. I could see that not being so cooperative on how that money gets split up if there's an abandonment.
There's sort of a related policy issue, which is, I guess, since I'm not the lawyer here for these purposes, it's my biggest concern is I'm not saying I'm against it. It's just something that we need to have a very frank discussion about is, are we creating a cemetery like financial institutions 11 years ago that's too big to fail? And to the extent I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. It's something to think about is what can we do to mitigate that as an issue, assuming the legal issues can be resolved. But that's sort of a big picture piece of this. Of course, the flip side of it is, this is a little bit of an overstatement, but this is a very large cemetery and it's not a small town, but this would be a fairly large abandonment for the town to absorb. So I don't want to use the term too big to fail in that context, but balancing against too big to fail as a cemetery corporation is a big abandonment, which means a big imposition for the town to have to swallow.
So just so I'm clear, what we would be talking about with that concern would be that Forest Lawn has to abandon all of the cemeteries that it has taken on in these mergers.
Right.
And then you have all of these different towns, but this corporation itself then is based someplace else. And so you're saying there's going to be a scramble among all of these physical localities.
This is a permanent obligation of Forest Lawn to deal with this cemetery if this goes through.
Right.
So we're not talking about the possibility of Forest Lawn abandoning this piece.
Right.
We're talking about the whole thing going
yes,
under, which is
yes.
admittedly not incredibly likely, but it's something
And the
at least to
individual
think
cemeteries, then, the abandonments to the towns wouldn't be the individual towns where they're located,
about. No, it would.
It would.
It would be.
but
The way town law works, it's
Except a big chunk of it would be in the city of Buffalo.
yeah, it's whatever.
There is no answer.
I can find the exact language, but 91.
That's where it is.
Almost there. The town board of any town must also provide for removal of grass and weeds at least twice in each year from any cemetery or burial ground by whomsoever owned in such town, where such control is not vested, and provide for the preservation and care of any such cemetery, and the town board of any town must also provide for removal of grass and weeds of all cemeteries other than burial grounds which are abandoned, not controlled by an existing board. So it's in such town is the key language.
and in such town is where Forest Lawn is located.
No.
Where the
town is where each, well, for example, Whispering Maples. Its principal place of business was probably Plattsburgh? Or the other town? Ellenburg. Its principal place of business was in Ellenburg.
Right.
But we treated each parcel as abandoned to each town. So Ellenburg got its parcel abandoned to it. Plattsburgh got its parcel abandoned to it. So if Forest Lawn, the entire entity, becomes abandoned, each piece that's in any town gets abandoned to that town.
Right.
And the primary location is in a city. It wouldn't be abandoned to the city. It would just
Yeah.
Well, the city wouldn't have to take
would
it.
not be obligated to take it over. So, yeah.
And then the concern is that by taking on all of these other, merging with all these other cemeteries, are you increasing the likelihood that that Forest Lawn is going to fail, and then you're creating this.
I'll join Lewis in saying that Forest Lawn appears to be a very well-run entity. We, as far as I know, Division has no issues with how Joseph Dispenza and his board have been running their main operation and the cemeteries that they have taken over by merger. But you just never know. I mean, we've had another cemetery where when the primary operator retired, they added to his pension inappropriately, and now that cemetery is in bad shape. I think you're familiar with that.
Yes.
Well,
So good can sometimes become bad very quickly.
I mean, if looking at this, from a numbers perspective, our concern isn't so much with this particular transaction. I think they've sold us a story that looking at it purely as a financial matter, leaving aside whether it's legal, leaving aside all that other stuff.
Those are the certificates of incorporation.
This particular merger does appear to be likely to benefit both. So if that were the only issue, we'd actually be here recommending approval. So I'm not concerned about that that this particular transaction is going to weaken Forest Lawn per se. But at some point, it becomes so big that there's so many commitments in so many places that it's just not something we've dealt with before. The closest analogy I can come up with, which is not a very good analogy at all, as Council pointed out last month, is we have a few cemeteries that are effectively controlled by out-of-state entities where they have certificates of incorporation, of indebtedness, or land share certificates that they've acquired. Maybe it's those particular cemeteries that generally hasn't been a happy tale. Although again, it's not a good analogy in a lot of respects. I mean, Forest Lawn is used to running a regulated entity. They're not.
So anyway, first of all, I think these are important questions. I'm not sure it's entirely precedent setting because we've already approved Forest Lawn merging with other cemeteries in the county in different towns.
Right. You already have the problem of allocating resources.
So that's sort of plowed ground in one sense. But the other thing is that there is a sort of an urgency to this. So I think the plan that we've got is that Tony has spoken to the attorneys. We're looking for them to provide us with responses to those questions. And we need to bring this back to the board in a timely way so that we can make sure that the interests of the current cemetery, which is failing, are met, right? I mean, if it's a no, well, that's a different story. That might have to worry about that. But we don't want this to be stopped by questions. We want it to be resolved by an attempt to get answers to those policy questions.
Yeah,
right?
I'll go back to what Council said at the beginning, which is ideally what he had asked for is what I'd like to see too is I'd love to see that response from the attorney once you're done with it before it goes to you guys, not just because if we can get that soon and you are comfortable with the legal issues, we could come back here with a recommendation of approval.
We
can't do that if they're reporting directly to you. We can come back with a recommendation instead of having it open.
Obviously, they should work it out. They should give their answers to Tony, and the division should review those answers, and they should come to the board as soon as it can.
Right.
We have a pretty quick turnaround in terms of next board meeting agendas. It's really like in a couple of weeks we're trying to get stuff done so we can get it out on time. Sometimes we fail in that just because the time is compressed. But there is an urgency here that I think we need to acknowledge. We do have a premier cemetery with some history to judge this against. It's the policy and legal questions, which may already have been breached, that we have to try to resolve. So,
but Tony, those are the questions, the issues that you raised here. Those are the questions that you've asked council.
Yes, and more.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
again, so the board needs to, when they get a packet, we get a packet that is resolved, in terms of our view of those issues. And again, there's this issue of urgency.
But we gave you the full write-up this time just so that when this does come back, it doesn't come out of left field.
Right.
Okay.
There's no one here from Forest Lawn. I wasn't sure if they were going to.
Yes, there is.
Dave's here.
Did you want? I my position.
Dave, something you want to add to that?
Absolutely. David Fleming from the Featherston Law Firm representing Forest Lawn. To the points made by your able counsel, this is a critical situation. Application was submitted in October of last year. The cemetery is going to fail shortly. We spoke to the president on Friday. That is a certainty. They are in a position where they are, as was stated, eating through the funds that they have. The business plan that was submitted in detail to the division shows a clear and obvious benefit to Forest Lawn for taking over the cemetery, over $4 million in funds, which would be a significant investment in the endowment for all the cemeteries. The comment about other cemeteries coming down the road, this is absolutely no secret whatsoever. It was in the packet that was submitted with this application. The cluster model that Forest Lawn is utilizing as a business model, they already utilize through multiple cemeteries across New York. This particular cemetery is in an area that has serious cemetery issues. This is not the only cemetery that will be failing in this community. In fact, this cemetery and others in that community have come to Forest Lawn. Forest Lawn did not go to these cemeteries. There are employees at that cemetery that will be retained and would be used as the hub for some of the models that they've discussed and outlined to you. What's interesting to note here is that this is a model that's already being utilized across the state of New York, whether it's formal or informal. In Rensselaer County, which is over 650 square miles, there are current cluster models already where you have a digger who is dealing with 20-some cemeteries and is essentially operating all of those cemeteries on behalf of the regulated cemeteries in New York. I know this because two of them happen to be mine that I operate in Rensselaer County. So it's a model that clearly works. It's about scale. So if you already have employees that you can keep them busy while they're working on other projects. You have increased funding capacity through Forest Lawn by increase in their ability to invest their finances and have a professional take on it. What is also outlined is the fact that Forest Lawn has an excellent track record in being able to look at a cemetery and find out ways in which they can maximize revenue. The folks at this cemetery are not in that position, and frankly, they're at the stage in their management of the cemetery that they're not interested in doing some of those things. I mean, really practical things about making it easier for funeral directors to be able to interact with the cemetery simply by being able to have an email address and cell phones and be able to call into folks. There was discussion about lot owner involvement. I think we have an excellent track record at the cemeteries we've already taken over, and in fact, Forest Lawn is already said to the new cemeteries that they're looking at that they would provide remote locations for the annual board meeting. That they have the Wendt Center, which is a now world famous research facility at Forest Lawn, which is technologically advanced, I think, more than most of our operations that you folks are regulating. They have the ability to have remote access and actually have someone physically present at the location where the cluster model would be. So they have that ability to interact. They set up websites for the cemetery. They set up interaction with the community. And part of their track record, which is really proven to work, is that they get involved in the communities in which they're operating because that's a way to increase revenue to the cemetery, to get organizations that are in the community to have an insight or investment in that particular cemetery. So there is a significant opportunity. Forest Lawn believes for their own growth. They think that there's a significant opportunity for Chenango Valley that approach them to maintain the cemetery in a way that I think is significant for the future, certainly for their funds. And as far as how the funds are split and what these opportunities are, the cemetery is going to fail if nothing is done. And not just this cemetery, several in the region that we've talked to. We're looking at going forward with a model that we already have a track record that shows it works. There is a distance issue that is going to be addressed by having employees who are on the ground who are also supervised by employees who are supervising the remote cemeteries. But those funds going into Forest Lawn, almost like a prenup, are clear. You know what those funds are. They've been disclosed to the board. They've been disclosed to the division. There can easily be an allocation based on what the initial investment was in return on those funds, if there was a problem. Forest Lawn, as it was pointed out, is one of the most successful cemeteries in the state of New York. They have a tremendous operation and track record. I think this really just dovetails well into a way that they're concerned about these smaller cemeteries, and frankly, there is no other way under current statute to deal with this other than by abandonment. And I can tell you right now that that's where we're heading with this particular cemetery. So we'll be happy to get you the information you're requesting. Whether or not it's what you'll be looking for, based on the questions that I have, we'll certainly be putting that together. More than happy to answer any specific questions. If there's anything in advance of the next meeting, they really understand how important it is to get this done. This is something that has been approved by both boards, duly noticed, and has been out there for some time now. Thank you.
Anybody have any?
I have a question. Do we have, or is this something that you've asked for information about the other cemeteries that they've merged with? And I know you mentioned that there are, that there's employees on the ground who then report to people at the central office. Do we know what that looks like at the cemeteries where we're merged with?
I don't.
I mean,
It
that might be
depends
helpful.
on the operation. Some that are close by do not have any employees that are operating. Some that are further out have these teams. They have a team like a lot of other rural cemeteries have, which are their maintenance crews that are going around to all these facilities, as well as all of the other kind of office things, which is not happening in this particular issue, at this particular application, are centralized. You pick up a phone and you dial the number, it doesn't matter. It's going to the switchboard, and you'll have a salesperson, you'll have
A switchboard. Come on.
So when a funeral director
Using
calls,
rotary phones.
then they get
Right.
the central office, but there's somebody there
Telex.
that, as if
has
they're
all the
calling the
mapping,
local.
has everything for
So there
Shenango
would be
Valley. Right.
only enhancements in how, like, the warm hand. type
Yeah,
stuff
and I think
happening.
that's really an important point. I think, Forest Lawn has a really good model on how they interact with their colleagues in the industry. And I think that helps the families. I think if you have a quick response and you can make arrangements in a much easier way. If you're not, this is a mobile society. People are wanting to send an email. Field directors are wanting to make an appointment as easily as possible. That's not happening in a lot of these places. They're, rural cemeteries are run. Frankly, the cemeteries that I represent on a municipal level, they're only open from 9 to noon, some of them. The town hall is only open a few hours a day. So it's not that convenient. And the field director has to drop off a check and has to do all that process. So our regulated cemeteries do it better, and particularly these larger cemeteries who have a professional staff and the ability to respond quickly.
So how many cemeteries are under the Buffalo umbrella right now?
I knew you were going to ask that. I'm thinking 7, but it might be 6.
But we have experience with those cemeteries. There's nobody said to me that there's any concerns about the cemeteries that they've taken over. Right?
We've actually gotten positive comments from a couple of them once they were merged in.
Yeah, it's a new day, and we're looking for solutions to these kinds of things. And I think, really, rightly or wrongly, the distance, the scope of it, heightened the interest in, looking at some of the policy issues that again may have been invoked or breached in the others. So, but we understand that. So we're looking for solutions. We just want to make sure we've done our due diligence as a board.
Well, I appreciate that. If I could just say one more thing. I think it's just important, I think, to note the cluster model and how it is totally different, but not completely different to how rural cemeteries are currently operating. And that is to have essentially a single location, which is then servicing particular areas. So to have they're saving the money in the staff, they're saving the money in the maintenance, machinery, all of those things, because it's all centralized. And if they have to dispatch something else, they're dispatching it from another property or another resource, not the cemetery trying to figure out how to pay for it.
I agree with that, but that's different than the corporate entity change. You've got a centralized operating model. It's different than changing the corporate structure. Right?
It's different.
It's different. I think it's real different. But again, I think it's a new world, and we operate with every day in dramatically different fashions than probably our laws and regulations even contemplated when they were being written. So we have to find a way to deal with that so we can solve the problems that we're facing. couldn't agree with you more that it's a very important topic and a potential, and we've got a real an organization with a real success record, so that we can look at it, clearly to see what the challenges are. So my hope is that we'll be able to bring this back for the next board meeting.
That's going to depend on how quick they get back to Tony.
Right. Well, and how clear we are with what we're looking for, right? So, I mean, that's part of what I'm saying here, Board Chair. I want to make sure that we are clear about what we need, so they can respond to us as quickly as possible, and then we review that as quickly as possible.
What did you ask for tonight?
I basically just pointed out all the issues that I saw, legal and policy. I mean, just to throw one out that we haven't mentioned yet, is cemeteries are local. If you look throughout our statute and regulations, local concerns pop up everywhere. There's buying land, selling land, conducting major registration, adding a mausoleum. We post signs. It's not just for landowners, it's for the neighborhood. Putting up a crematory. So being responsive to your locality is complete through Article 15 in our regs. And it's one thing to have, as Forest Lawn does, 6 cemeteries all close together. It's quite another thing when you're in far-flung communities. So that, and well, I basically laid out all the issues that I could think of and asked for them to respond. I tried to be as neutral in my presentation as I can tell you honestly, I have no idea legally how this will fall. I'm really interested to get, and Forest Lawn has top-notch counsel. I know I'm going to get a nice, detailed response. I'll be interested to see what it says.
To the extent your questions didn't cover the issue of allocation of funds on abandonment, we do need to know what their thoughts are. God forbid this whole thing goes under.
Yeah.
And you're representing Forest Lawn when you're
I am.
Okay, not the other.
And I wasn't, our firm wasn't the one that Tony was referring to, but we'll still take it as a. Yes, I think we represent Forest Lawn.
So I'm the wrong thing.
All right, so are there any other board discussions about this application? Okay. So I would bring up application for Wellwood Cemetery. Lewis.
Holler when you're done.
Okay, this Wellwood Cemetery comes to us before. It's sort of I think it's not that complicated, but they have an application to tear down their office building, which they have abandoned. They've abandoned it a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, maybe more, and moved their offices in with an adjoining cemetery. At the time, we disapproved their application to demolish the building and instructed them to come back to us with a resolution of the fact that the two boards are clones of each other. They're guessing that was an adaptation to get around the county law, which said you couldn't have a cemetery of over 250 acres. So state law, county for Suffolk County, and so forever they've operated as two boards, although the board members are identical. That doesn't allow the boards to comply with not-for-profit law, muddies the water, so they could either figure out a way to split the boards or figure out how to merge the boards. They came back to us again with the same application. There were some earlier requests for the cemetery to pay for certain renovations to the Beth Moses office building. They've dropped that. This is, as far as I understand, a straight-up application from Wellwood to demolish the building with their general funds. I said to them, privilege of the chair, when we were there times before, is, I didn't see any big advantage to the building that they're not using, deteriorating, sort of poke a hole in the roof and demolish by time. But they had to come back to us with a plan about how we're going to resolve things. I didn't feel like they had adequately done that in the past. Since then, they've engaged the services of a law firm, a lobbying firm, represented by Dave Fleming here, and I've seen copies of bills in the legislature that have been put in through home rule. I don't know if they got the home rule yet. But they're copies of the legislature that would allow them to have one cemetery of over 250 acres in the county of Suffolk. So as far as I'm concerned, they've complied with my request. Again, I act as a person, the board acts as a body. My personal request that they come back with a plan that gave me confidence that they were taking the issue seriously, and now they've got the application back in front of us. So again, division or council can weigh in, but they've complied with my request to come back with a legitimate plan for resolution of the issue.
Yeah, so it was in 2015 that this first came in front of the board. I think it was 2015. It was a joint application by the two cemeteries, Beth Moses and Wellwood, to, I want to make sure I get it right. Beth Moses wanted to renovate its building and have the Wellwood building torn down and have Wellwood share part of the cost. I don't remember, it was 50-50, 60-40, something like that, of renovating Beth Moses' building. That once that was done, they would both be using. Anyway, musical interlude. So, it was the first time this cemetery board became aware that these two distinct corporate entities were pretty much operating as one. And at the time, the cemeteries themselves didn't know, and the board didn't know, that the reason for that was because if they were one cemetery, they would violate the 250-acre limitation in Suffolk County, which is a state law. So we learned that after this board directed them to, as Chair pointed out, permission was granted to do the renovation at Beth Moses, solely at Beth Moses' expense. Permission was not granted to take down the Wellwood building. They were directed to come back with either a plan to merge or completely separate. Well, completely separate wasn't the board's language, but that was generally what was requested. One or the other, separate or merge. 3 years later, last year, they came back with the application to again take down the building, but they hadn't taken any steps to either merge or separate themselves. After coming back to us and being told that they've got to move one way or another, they came up with basically a one-page agreement on how to share costs, but that clearly didn't meet what the board had requested. And the board again directed them, pick one or the other, and show us you're taking steps. And then we'll consider this application. So now what they've done is they've dropped the portion of the application about funding. So they are only seeking authority to demolish the Wellwood building at Wellwood's expense. And do you have a bill number for me on that bill? Because somehow it's not in my list.
I can get it for you while we're sitting here.
But there is a legislation, I've seen it. It doesn't mention the cemeteries by name. Well
On
done.
purpose.
Yes. But it references, I can't remember the details of how it gets around that, but it does reference, by the way it's written, it would permit these two cemeteries to merge and have more than the 250 acres as a single entity. So clearly, Beth Moses and Wellwood have taken steps now towards merging. So the question is, is the board sufficiently satisfied with the steps that they've taken, that it feels ready to approve the demolition of the Wellwood building at Wellwood's expense.
Yeah, the only clarification I make is the board didn't direct them to do that. That was going to be privilege of the chair, if you will, but because we didn't take a vote or anything. So that was just the board is now in receipt of their application. So again, division has reviewed the applications. And recommending that they can do this using their general fund.
Do you remember the cost?
$139,000.
Senate 3952.
Say that again?
Senate 3952.
3952. Thank you.
They have in their general fund, Wellwood had $13 million in their general fund, so 139. I think that represents less than 1% of their total assets.
So basically, the change now is that Wellwood is agreeing to bear the cost, and at the same time, we can see that active steps and have been taken to change the law so that they can merge.
I should also point out there is an audit being conducted. Gus, some of you are familiar with. He actually is with another agency, and he's loaned out to us for special projects. He does forensic accounting, and he's doing an audit of this cemetery. He's done some preliminary findings, but he's not near. He's very thorough, which means, and because we only get him occasionally, he's limited in how many hours he can give us each week. But so it's going to take time for him to conduct to finalize his audit. But that is ongoing.
Based upon his review of their annual reports, though, their CPA reports, he doesn't expect to really find anything really bad.
Right, and if we do, we deal with them
Right.
when they come up. So, again, I mean, this whole thing that we're flying by the fact that the two cemeteries are now sort of they're indistinguishable. So, is this truly in Wellwood's interest because the boards are the same? We can't. They make the conversations are all sort of we. They just simply are acting as one, whether we like it or not. So we're just sort of flying by all of that. But I think, again, to me, the legislature could fail to pass this legislation. I don't see anything that would, why they would, but you never know. It doesn't change anything for the county because it all does is deal with what already exists. So they're not asking for more land.
Right.
So I don't see it as long as the local communities request that the state legislature make the change. I just don't see it as being a big problem. But if it was, we'd have to deal with that some other way. That said, the building would still be there. It doesn't, again, to my mind, do any good to have it sitting there unused.
Right.
Again, it's not in danger of falling down. They've taken a look at it. It's in relatively good shape, but there's no good come from a building sitting there. Not in particularly in.
They're not using it.
They're not using
it.
it. They're using Beth Moses. It's not really in either board's interest to have a building that's just sitting there. So, again, and they have plenty of funds to do it. So
Yeah. So in that respect, you sort of have done the analysis of is it in Wellwood's best interest to do it? Yeah.
to the degree that you believe me, yep. So again, I'll entertain a motion since I've sort of spoken my piece on that. But do we have a motion to approve this application?
I would.
Okay.
Second.
Great. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Approved. I don't think we. I mean, you mentioned the issue of the delegated powers. Does there need to go to session on that now? There's nothing. It's under review. There's some things that we have to.
Actually, yeah, I think it deserves at least a few minutes of time today.
Okay. So I need a motion. There's no other business after that. If there was, we would come out of executive session, and we will come out of executive session with any business that was conducted. Can I have a motion to go?
Public comment. Public comment.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Public comment. Yes, Dave?
We can invite Lewis back in, too.
Right. Does anybody here have any public comment they'd like to make?
I do if no one else does.
Guys.
You knew that was going to be the case.
So, David Fleming from the New York State Association of Cemeteries. Just on two quick things that were discussed earlier. On the notice issue on the withdrawal of the memo, NISAC's happy to put that information out as well, and we're happy to send that to all of our members and get that information out. We'll put it on our website.
Great. Thanks. Oh, you can bill us later.
Yeah. And then the other issue that Lewis brought up, and that is on radioactivity. So we just recently held our NISAC board meeting. It was a subject of discussion. We have actually created a task force. We're happy to work with the division and interested parties on that issue. It is relevant and it is timely, in particular because Ontario has prohibited the cremation of human remains with certain devices or radioactivity levels or treatments. And they have approached crematories in the United States and in New York to conduct those cremations. So that is something that we are interested in and looking at the implications of what that might be. So we're happy to work with the division and anyone else, but we have a task force of crematory operators who are looking at this issue.
So does that mean that they're measuring radioactivity of the body?
There's the types of procedures that are being conducted based on the amount of time since the procedure was done. There is a general standard radioactive output, and obviously, as Mr. Fuller would know, if that procedure was just conducted and the decedent dies as a result of complications associated with that, you're at the height of the radioactivity. But also keep in mind that one news story that we've been hearing about is on a particular case which has to be really fully examined. There hasn't been a real study, but it's obviously something that we're looking at. And so we offer up any cooperation that we can.
Thanks for mentioning that.
I think we'll take you up on that.
Okay. Anyone else have public comment?
What?
Oh, yes,
so our
next
next
meeting?
meeting is April 9th, I believe.
We need a lot of props in this business.
Our next meeting is April 9th at 10:30. And the next meeting after that will be on May 6th, which is a Monday.
Because we're at the...
Because we'll be at your meeting, which is where this year?
At the Desmond.
At the Desmond. So,
What was the second meeting?
May 6th, 10 o'clock, not 10:30, correct?
I believe so. I can confirm.
So it usually is. And it'll be at the Desmond as opposed to here.
Okay, can you send me an email?
I will do that. I will send it
I don't have that
appointment.
one.
No, we don't have that one in because we
Okay.
don't have it yet. And after that, we'll presumably go back to our second Tuesday of the month following.
Okay. Right, so meeting is moved to executive session.
Yep.
Thank you.
Second?
We already did that.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
Just,